Last week, we began looking at the Sabbath and the commandment of the Sabbath in the context of the New Testament. Actually, we started it even before that, I think, but and what we looked at, there was a couple of examples with Jesus of doing things on the Sabbath that the Pharisees at least believed he ought not to be doing. The first was going through grain fields with his disciples and picking heads of grain to eat as they went along. The second, and in the case of the first one, Jesus justified that by pointing to the example of David, who was fleeing from Saul, entered into the house of God, where Abiathar was serving as the high priest, who gave him consecrated bread, as well as, I pointed out, the sword of Goliath, and pointed out Jesus makes the argument that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, and that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, we talked extensively about the story behind the justification that he's talking about there, about the fact that David made the argument to Abiathar that he was on a mission from God and therefore had a legitimate reason to access the bread. And we talked about the idea that something that's consecrated in the service of someone who is doing consecrated work has a different meaning, has a different significance. And we talked about Jesus obviously being consecrated in his role, but also then the idea that when we look at the Sabbath more broadly, the Sabbath's purpose is to benefit and to bless man, not the other way around. And so, in a sense, the consecration, the separation, the fact that the Sabbath is made significant and distinct from the other days of the week is not about something special about the day in and of itself. It's about doing something good for man, and thus using the Sabbath in a way that keeps men from doing things that are beneficial to themselves or necessary would be an abuse of the Sabbath. That at least appears to be Jesus' basic argument here. We moved on and talked about another passage over in Mark where Jesus is in a synagogue. There's a man there with a withered hand. It is most likely based on some of the other Gospels that this man was probably brought there by the Pharisees specifically to put him in front of Jesus on the Sabbath to see what he would do, see if he would heal him. And he has them come forward and asks them if it's lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill. And they won't answer him. And of course it says then that he's angry and grieved at their hardness of heart, and he heals the man. And the Pharisees at that point go out and begin conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. And the point there is that by healing him on the Sabbath, using the power of God, he demonstrated that clearly God was not only was God not in opposition to what he was doing, but that God was supportive of what he was doing, and thus it undermined the credibility of the Pharisees. It was a direct attack against them in a sense, and so that is where the conspiracy begins, because the idea of him speaking things they don't like is one thing, but the idea of him demonstrating in an irrefutable way that his authority supersedes their authority was not something that they could accept. And so we have this idea that Jesus establishes that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. We also have this idea that he establishes that the Sabbath is subsumed in his authority as the Lord of the Sabbath, and that the purpose of the Sabbath is not simply for rule keeping, but rather for the benefit of mankind. So, with all that in mind, then we see as we move into the church era, initially at least, history as well as what we observe in the scriptures tells us that the majority of the Christians, if not all of them, that were converted, well, let me start that over again. All of the Christians that were converted at the beginning of the early church were Jewish. That eventually extended out to the Samaritans, who by and large followed most Jewish customs, with the exception of where they worshiped. That was the single biggest disagreement with them, was worshiping on high places rather than worshiping in the temple. And yet, other than that, they tended to follow Jewish customs. They were circumcised, they didn't eat the same things the Jews did, they followed the same basic behavioral rules in general, and that extended to obeying the Sabbath as well. because they had a Jewish background, as did the Jews, not as directly, but they still did. So in the case of the original Jewish Christians, and in the case of the second major wave of conversion of the Samaritans, the Christians, by and large, continue to practice the Sabbath. And by and large, continue to practice most of the Jewish customs as well. They continue to go and offer sacrifices. They attended worship in synagogues. They followed the same kind of customs on what they ate and different things like that. We can see that in Peter's reaction when he's faced with God lowering the sheet down to him and saying, kill and eat. And he says, I don't eat stuff like that. He's still in that mode of, you don't eat stuff like that because you're Jewish Christian. And so the early Christians, being Jews and then Samaritans, followed the Jewish rules and regulations, including the Sabbath. That changed when the gospel spread beyond them. First to Cornelius, then to some of the others in that area, but very quickly the center of the Gentile Christian movement became the church at Antioch. The church that Barnabas and Paul would spend quite a bit of time at and were ultimately sent out on their first missionary journey from, was the church in Antioch. And Antioch is a church that's overwhelmingly composed of Gentile believers, as are a number of other ones, but it's a...
Sorry guys.
Wow, okay.
I have no idea what's happening. It's not turning off.
It's not just not turning off, it's like aggressively refusing to turn on.
That is the devil in it. Sorry guys. I'm so sorry about that.
I'm thinking there's something that's going to drill through that wall back there.
I have no idea what
really
is
not expecting that.
I'm so sorry about that.
Anyway, so the church in Antioch is where Paul and Barnabas are when a group of Judaizing Christians comes up from Jerusalem and begins to try to teach that the Samaritans, or not the Samaritans, sorry, the Gentile Christians have to follow all the Jewish commands and laws, which would include celebrating the Sabbath, but I suspect that they were more immediately concerned about the whole circumcision thing, because that would have been the thing I would have been most focused on personally. But whatever it was, they were basically saying, you've got to do all this stuff. And the Gentile Christians are confused by this because Paul wasn't teaching them that, Barnabas wasn't teaching them that. They had been basically living as Gentiles, except that they were behaving as Christians in the sense of, obeying the gospel and living moral lives, but they were not following Jewish customs in the broader sense. And so ultimately, this is resolved by Paul and Barnabas as well as some other men, along with the Judaizers going back to Jerusalem. There's a council that's held, the council of the church of Jerusalem. The apostles, the elders are there. They discuss the matter, and ultimately the decision is that the Gentiles should in fact follow a small number of Jewish customs. Anybody know what those are? The ones that they actually called out?
Don't eat blood.
Don't eat blood.
No strangled meat.
No strangled meat, which is kind of tied in with that, because if you strangle it, the blood gets into the meat. What else?
Abstain from fornication.
Abstain from fornication, and one other one.
Is it idolatry?
Well, meat sacrificed to idols, actually. I'm assuming because they didn't mention idolatry specifically, that was something Paul had taught them, because idolatry would be contrary to Christianity just as much as it's contrary to Judaism, whereas meat sacrificed to idols is kind of in a gray area for a lot of Gentiles who wouldn't necessarily see a problem with that. And there are other places where Paul seems to indicate that isn't really a problem, as long as, particularly if you don't know whether or not it's been sacrificed to idols. But those are the four things that they say don't do, or do, or however anyway. But the few Jewish customs that they were expected to follow. The Sabbath is not mentioned anywhere.
And they also encourage them to remember.
Yes, that's true. That one wasn't so much a command; it's just kind of yeah. So that's true. So what we see then is a very definitive transition. They knew that these Gentiles would not be following the Sabbath, and in many cases that was almost a necessity, because these Jews who lived in Samaria and lived in Jerusalem, they lived in a culture that was designed around the Sabbath. No businesses were going to be open, nobody expected you to be doing anything. It would not be at all harmful to your reputation or your economic livelihood or anything else to not be working on the Sabbath. But in most Gentile communities, it was pretty common to work 6 or 7 days a week, including what we would think of as Saturday. and it just depended on the community. But it would have been very problematic for them to have continued to operate in Gentile communities had they done it. Now, that doesn't mean, there's lots of other things that we're commanded to do that can sometimes make it problematic for us. So if God wanted them to do it, he certainly would have felt free to do that. But the reality is that here again, we see this example of Christianity and time grew beyond Judaism. And so Judaism no longer works outside of a very small area of the world where sacrifice is still allowed, where the customs are all designed around these things. At this point, the rest of the world has kind of left Judaism behind, and God is on the verge of leaving Judaism behind as well and taking it forward into Christianity. And now, at no point does God ever say to the Jewish Christians, hey, stop doing those Jewish things. Never says that to the Samaritans either. And Paul never says that either. Paul, in fact, explicitly says, if that's what you think you should be doing, then that's what you should be doing. But what God does clearly say is, that's not what I'm expecting or requiring of you anymore. And if your conscience doesn't dictate that you need to do it, then you don't need to do those things. Your conscience should be your guide in this regard. So there's been a transition here, and this idea that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and this idea of the Sabbath as something that was given to the Jews, much like many of these other customs and laws, is something that has not been given under this new covenant. Something that is not being enforced under this new covenant. So,
Did some confusion come because Jesus said, I did not come to make a new religion. It should only be Jews and Gentiles, followers of Jesus. And it's not that he left Judaism, it's not, but, well, the cross then did eliminate the Mosaic law. The Abrahamic law was never dealt with, that it's not here anymore. But when Jesus said, I did not come to make a new religion, of course he knows too what later on will come, because that the devil worse than the Jews with getting stuff heaped on. That it's only to follow him and the two commandments he gave.
yes.
To love your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your mind and strength. And the second one is unto you, to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the thing that Jesus gave. It takes care of the 10 commandments. But he did not say, now Christianity is a separate religion.
That's true, but Jesus never identified what he was doing as a religion in general. In fact, there's only a few places in the entire scripture that the word religion is even used. What Jesus identified was a different way of looking at reality, and then when he was taken up into heaven, he left behind instructions for his followers to wait for more information, more knowledge that was given to them. So I think it's fair to say that Jesus didn't come to establish a new religion. He came to save souls and save mankind through his sacrifice, but that ultimately that sacrifice established a new covenant, and that covenant replaced the Mosaic covenant. Now, the Abrahamic relationship and covenant with God, I would argue, is pretty much the same in most respects as the Christian covenant with God. In fact, there's a number of times where Paul in particular talks about that our faith is like Abraham's faith. Our relationship is like Abraham's relationship. It's a faith-based relationship and not a law-based relationship. So certainly I would think that archetype is still very relevant for us today as Christians. But however you want to phrase it and whether you want to, what kind of semantics you want to get into it, the net effect of what Jesus did was to replace the laws of Moses with a more fundamental law that underpinned the laws of Moses without needing all the details, sort of. So, Jerry.
Acts 20 and 7 is probably 15, maybe 10 to 15 years after Acts 15. And here, Paul is in Troas, which is Gentile, and he says, on the first day of the week, they came together to break bread. Now, the Gentiles were apparently, from this verse, and maybe a couple of inferences otherwise, they were meeting on the first day of the week. When were the Jews meeting? Were they meeting on the Sabbath for the Jewish nation or Jewish relationship and the first day of the week, or were they just meeting on the Sabbath for several years until things changed?
I would say that that's not really entirely clear. We don't, so the reference you talk about in Troas is actually the only specific reference we have to them deliberately meeting on the first day of the week.
Yeah.
And breaking bread. Now it's a little bit dangerous to say that what it is saying is they met on the first day of the bread for the express purpose of the first day of the week for the express purpose of baking bread. What it really is saying, or what the underlying language is really saying is they met on the first day of the week and they were going to break bread. So there is a relationship, but not necessarily a causal relationship between those two things. Just as we see at the beginning of Acts, where they're meeting, every day and they're breaking bread, and so that one reference is the only one that we have in the scriptures to specifically. We're meeting on the first day of the week. We're going to break bread. However, by the 3rd century, at the latest, there are writings from church leaders talking about everybody meets on the first day of the week. And so we know from history, from other sources as well. So it appears that at some point that became the universal practice. But it's not entirely clear what the Jewish Christians were doing initially. The tendency is to assume that they were meeting on the first day of the week and simply celebrating the Sabbath, because it's important to remember that the Jews in celebrating the Sabbath didn't go worship somewhere on the Sabbath. That would have actually broken the rules of the Sabbath for someone to have been doing the worship functions, for them to have walked a certain distance to get to the synagogue or whatever. So the Sabbath wasn't a worship day, not a formal assembly kind of worship day. It was a day for reflection and for meditation and prayer and those kinds of things. So it wouldn't be all surprising if the Christians were meeting on the first day of the week and worshiping together and then celebrating the Sabbath on the 7th day of the week like they always have. It's just not entirely clear.
In the realms of theology, one of the things that we as humans really struggle with is freedom.
Yeah.
And as you've already pointed out, God did not see fit to command a continuation of the Sabbath worship, but beyond that, he did not see fit to command a specific day to gather, worship, and break bread, what we call communion.
Yeah.
And so it's left to us, for the most part, to determine when and how and where we want to do those things that are so fundamentally important to our faith. And so as you say, by the 3rd century, the tradition, and traditions aren't evil, had become they met on the first day of the week to share communion. And there's obvious reasoning behind it. Christ was raised on the first day of the week.
Right.
And that's the biggest marker that points to that day now having some special significance that it did not have under the law of Moses. And so we can be confident and comfortable that coming together on the first day of the week is perfectly acceptable to God, but we need to be careful if there are others who have a different day that they want to do the same thing, and they might also still be fully acceptable to God.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's interesting you mentioned this, and I should have said this earlier. In that same writing that's talking about the meeting on the first day of the week, the guy actually says it that way. We all meet on the first day of the week because that's when Jesus was raised. So it's like, of course we meet on the first day of the week. But what he doesn't say is that's the way it's always been either. And this is a guy who's a lot closer to that event than obviously we are now, who probably was within 2 or 3 generations at most of the 1st century, and yet he doesn't explicitly say that. Again, I think it would not be at all surprising if they had been meeting on the first day of the week, but it's not necessarily a certainty. And as Ken says, I've long been very hesitant to say that the fact that we see that on the one occasion in in Acts there of them deciding to meeting on the first day of the week to break bread is dispositive as an example of when we are expected to meet, as opposed to an example of what is a good idea, that best practices versus requirement thing that I talk about sometimes. I think that we got to be kind of careful about that when we extrapolate from an example to say, and this is the rule for everybody for all time. So,
What's some of the other versions? Because the King James and the New King James. Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, it appears to be a purpose in it.
okay, but think about that sentence for a second. On the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. So they came together to break bread on the first day of the week. That doesn't mean that they necessarily did it because it was the first day of the week. It simply means they came together to break bread, and that was the first day of the week when they did it.
I guess I've always read it.
I had two for a long time.
Yeah.
But the problem with that reading is that it's not we read causality into it, and there isn't necessarily causality. It would be like saying when I was at the doctor's office on Thursday. Well, I wasn't at the doctor's office because it was Thursday. I happened to be at the doctor's office and it happened to be Thursday. Those two things are caused only in the sense that the doctor made an appointment for me to go on Thursday.
The same context, it talks about staying 7 days. So there apparently was some reason that they were staying, that Paul and his party stayed 7 days. Now, I don't know if it was Thursday to Thursday or something, but it does.
I think that there's the indication that this is Acts 15 now.
That's 20.
20, yeah. I think the indication in there is that they were waiting for something. I gotta take a look at this myself, so let me see here.
You want to hear my?
Verse 6.
Yes, I do actually.
Okay, it's verse 7. On the first day of the week, we gathered with the local believers to share in the Lord's Supper.
So that's a little ambiguous as well, yeah.
Yeah, it's got that, so,
And it says
The
also
ESV
that,
says, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread.
this
Well, that's a
also
little more
is like, it says that the believer in Christ, they still did go to the synagogue or temple on Saturday, but then after the first day, it starts 6 in the evening because that's when the day started for them. After they could walk, not only what they said, you can only walk so
Right.
many miles. They did go to house to house to house to break bread with the brethren, with the other follower of Christ. So that was in the evening, and it says they praised Yeshua, Jesus, till midnight.
where are you? Are you talking about in
I
Acts
need
20 or are you
to
talking?
look up in which one that is, but then they said that the disciples still did go to the synagogue and worship, and then on the first day, that would be in the evening, that they went to house to house.
Well, where is this? What scriptures? I'm not
I
familiar with that.
think that she's,
So I'm
I
going to give you a
don't,
second to look that up. So to address what you were asking, Jerry, it talks about that they sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. So it's likely that they waited there to finish the days of unleavened bread, and then they came to them at Troas within 5 days, and we stayed there for 7 days. That's probably just a matter of just kind of keeping track of where they were for how long, because Luke is doing that all the way along in here, talking about how long they were there.
And then down at verse 13, they went to the ship, Paul stayed behind as he had arranged. So they may have stayed 7 days, but that's what the ship said.
Could be.
That's what I was gonna say, because if you read on in verse 7, the second part of that was, on the first day of the week when we gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart the next day.
Right.
So it's like, it might have just been,
Yeah.
I got stuff to do tomorrow.
Yeah.
So,
Now, I think the most likely sequence of this is that they stayed there 7 days, and I suspect, as Ken says, to catch the ship. But I also think that they're meeting on the first day of the week, most likely because that is the day that Jesus is resurrected. they're celebrating the feast, the communion because that's the day that Jesus is resurrected. It's interesting that they're not celebrating it on the day of the week that the Passover would have taken place. They're celebrating on the first day of the week, apparently deliberately. And Paul is concerned and wants to make sure that he's going to leave the next day, but he's going to be there for that. So there does seem to be some significance. I just think that the mistake we make sometimes when we read this is saying it's caused one by the other, and I'm not sure we can necessarily read that into it. But again, we do have confidence that by the 3rd century, it is a uniform practice that everybody's doing it on the first day of the week. So,
Actually, weren't they taking the Lord's Supper on Monday? Because
yes, I know.
it says, after
midnight,
the guy fell out of the window after midnight when he fell asleep, it says, then they all went back upstairs, shared in the Lord's Supper, and ate together. So that would have been Monday.
Right. I've had this conversation with people before who are determined that that this was an example of them taking the Lord's Supper on Sunday, because technically, if they did it after midnight, then they actually took it on Monday.
Yeah.
But I think the trying to, when you start to parse this down too much, you run into the exact same kind of thinking that the Pharisees were using when they're trying to get Jesus into trouble for eating the heads of grain or for healing on the Sabbath. They're trying to take it on the first day of the week. Now, whether that's because that was just kind of their plan or whether that's because of how it was scheduled, that's what they're doing. Just as a church that might, regularly meet on Sundays and take the Lord's Supper on Sundays, if something went really wrong and they couldn't meet until the next day, they might choose to take the Lord's Supper then. And I think we ought to be able to understand why God's okay with that without being too, freaked out about this notion that somehow, because we missed our window, that we have to skip it this month, this week or whatever, So I think that's it's absolutely true that they ended up taking it on Monday. Although you get into this fascinating discussion where we're talking about kind of what Sylvia was, where if it was they were recording it or they were taking it by Jewish rules, then it could conceivably have still been on the first day of the week if they had met after the sundown on Saturday. It would technically be Sunday by the Jewish law, which means that if it were after midnight, it would still be on the same Sunday. But that would mean that they were meeting and that they were recording this based on Jewish rules instead of Gentile rules in an entirely Jewish city with a recounting that's being written by a Gentile. Sorry, an entirely Gentile city with a recounting that's being written by a Gentile writer who was writing about a bunch of Gentile Christians getting together. None of which makes sense in the context of the story. So there is an argument that I've heard made for that, but it creates all kinds of problems, because the other problem that creates then is if that were true, then actually what that would mean is that we should be following Jewish times and rules for when we meet for our worship, and that we should make sure that we, like if we have an evening worship, it's got to happen before 6 o'clock, because if it happens after 6 o'clock, then it's the next day and it's not Sunday anymore. And if you think, well, that sounds ridiculous, why would we have to follow a rule like that? Well, because you've just made us follow a different rule based on Jewish customs, and if we're going to do it that way, then that apparently is an example we have to follow. So we start to get into this tortured, ugly sort of illogical logic, and the whole thing is made unnecessary with the simple realization that there's a huge amount of grace built into this. That's the whole point of the gospel, is grace, trying to figure out exactly what day or exactly what time it is. Especially, by the way, these are the people who didn't have a watch, so what is midnight anyway exactly? Is it actually midnight, or is it just got really dark and we're going to call it midnight? I mean, who knows? Anyway, Jerry, you got a hand, Mark, I think.
I was just going to use an example of something you just said. Yesterday, Ken called me, and I said, I'll see you after lunch. Well, it was 1 o'clock, and I hadn't had lunch. It was still good morning to me until I had lunch. I don't know what time it is. And that's what you're saying. And I think that's probably true with a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm just,
No, you're right. It's absolutely true.
Some people that are so rigid in the fact that, it has to be on Sunday and can't do it any other time and stuff. And it's really, I think just like the early Christians, they were meeting daily and taking
Right.
the Lord's Supper.
And-
And so,
Yeah.
you know, should we be meeting daily? You know, they take one
Right.
scripture and just think that's law.
And by the time we're in Troas, they're probably not meeting daily. And the reasons are several, but one of the biggest ones is that the early church, the very, very early church, most of them didn't have jobs. They were all a bunch of people who come there from out of town and decided to stay because of this crazy and wonderful thing that had happened. And the reason that so many people had to be selling their houses and giving things to the church was because these people didn't have a way to support themselves. So they could meet daily from house to house. But the simple fact is that most of the people that Paul is spreading the gospel to are the average kind of people who have, 6 or 7 day a week jobs. They're not meeting in houses every single day. Sometimes maybe they are in the evening or whatever. But there's probably something relatively special about this because it was the day that Paul wanted to go speak to them. It suggests that at least not all of them were able to get together the way that they were in this particular event, which would make a lot of sense because I don't think the whole church of Jerusalem, several thousand of them were getting together in each person's house from day to day. They were scattered around and doing things. So there's this very big mistake we make a lot of times when we're trying to apply the first century to today, and we're trying to apply a lot of rules or to figure out rules and regimens from what is basically a very fluid situation. People are just doing what seems like a good idea. They're just doing what feels right to them. They're being guided by the Holy Spirit. They're coming up with new ideas all the time. And by the time we get to the 3rd century, part of the reason why somebody's writing down and saying we all meet on Sunday is because by that time there had begun to be a much greater degree of organization in the church for a number of reasons, not the least of which, actually the biggest initial one, was Gnosticism. The heresy of Gnosticism was so powerful that it very nearly sank the church. And to prevent that, the churches had to organize at higher levels than they ever had before, and they started organizing at city levels and even at higher levels, district levels, and they started putting people in charge of those things. And those people started to become bishops and higher level officials and stuff like that in order to have a higher level of authority to be able to clamp down on those heresies. And as that began to happen, then it led itself into, once you have Christianity not only as a legal religion, but as the state-sponsored religion, it very naturally tends itself into an ultimate leader that is in charge of the whole thing. And that's where you get that from, is that need to organize to prevent heresy. Now, whether that was really a need as opposed to a human addition, who knows? But the fact is that once you start seeing people say, here's the rules, it almost always means that you've set up some level of organization that we don't necessarily see in the 1st century church.
Don't forget Mark.
Yes, sorry, Mark.
I was going to say, I think that's our problem. You even brought up about freedom. Christ gave us a lot of freedom here. And then we tend to, like Barbara was saying, we want to get into that rule thing.
Right.
But I think the most important thing about what Jesus said when he instituted the Lord's Supper, he said, do this in remembrance of me.
Yes.
What I'm going to do for you, I'm
never
about to
do
do, and I'm going to do it.
Yeah,
And I think
never do it, yeah.
that's the most important thing. It doesn't say, on this day, remember me,
Right.
and then the rest of the week, forget it. It says, remember me always, because this is what I did.
Yeah.
Or he did for us. So
Yeah.
I think that was the most important thing.
You're right, and you're actually getting ahead of me. We're going to get to that even more in just a second here, or maybe next Sunday, but that is an absolutely critical point for us.
To that point, and I could be making this up, I hope not, but didn't Jesus say for as often as you do it?
Yes.
Okay, so that kind of, like Mark was saying, he gives us quite a bit of freedom there.
Right.
Maybe just do it as much as you can.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, as often as you're thinking about it. So,
Yes.
okay, let's take it back. Sorry, Jerry, one more thing.
That has nothing to do with it.
Oh. Yeah, never mind, I'll judge for myself.
Solomon being somewhat had more wisdom than everybody else, made a comment that just may very well overlook or see all of this.
Okay.
Where he said, don't be too religious.
Don't be too religious. Yeah, one of the places that the word religion actually shows up in the Bible, ironically. So another one is where Paul actually is making fun of the Athenians for how spiritualist, how focused they are on all these different gods and stuff. I see that you are very religious. Okay, so let's move on to the other aspect of this when it comes to the Sabbath, and this is, or rather, to the aspect of the Sabbath that we do see in Paul's teachings in particular. You see this in Colossians. We also see it over in Romans, where Paul talks about this idea. He says, "Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." He says, you make your own decision. You need to do what is right to you. And over in Romans, he especially talks about that. You don't tell somebody else what they shouldn't or should or shouldn't do, because that'll mess with their conscience. And you don't do the stuff that you think is okay in front of people you know don't think it's okay, if it's going to mess with their conscience. But as far as you personally goes, as long as your conscience is clear, you're not required to eat or drink specific things or not. You're not required to celebrate certain festivals or holidays or Sabbaths or not. These are choices you can make. And then over in Romans, and I don't have this up here, I'm not sure why I don't, but over in Romans chapter 5 he says, "One person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord. He who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For this end, Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living." The purpose of Jesus' death was to free us from all of this regulation and the potential of sin and making things more complicated than they needed to be. It doesn't free us from all behavioral expectations, but it frees us from the stuff that's not core, as Sylvie talks about, core to what God wants. And the key is our conscience drives us. Now, if your conscience has been seared, and Paul talks about that, that can be a dangerous guy. But for those of us whose consciences have not been seared, for those of us who are being guided by the Holy Spirit, we have the ability to say, yeah, I'm going to celebrate this holiday. No, I'm not going to celebrate this holiday. What we don't have the ability to do is to say, you better not celebrate this holiday. You better celebrate this holiday. If you don't do it, you're a bad person or something like that. Or if you do, you're a bad person. And that's the mistake the Judaizers were making. So when we think about the Sabbath teaches us a lot of really important lessons about our relationship with God, about things like taking a break and giving ourselves some time to reflect and giving ourselves some time to focus on God. What it doesn't tell us is that every seventh day we've got to, stop doing any work and follow the literal rules of the Sabbath that we find in the law. So the principles are important. The specific details are a lot less important. And it's those specific details, of course, the irony of humanity is that we would much rather be caught up in the specific details and ignore the principles than the other way around. And it's not just the Pharisees that are like that. We're all like that. We would all much rather, it's kind of like the thing, well, tell me what I need to do. Well, exactly. I can't tell you what you need to do. I can tell you what kind of person you need to be. No, I don't want to know what kind of person I need to be, because that sounds really complicated. Just tell me what I need to do, Yeah. And so we don't want that a lot of times, because that's the grown-up thing. And I was talking about this with some of my students this past week, not in this context, but in a different context, and just occurs to me. We were talking about, one of them was saying he had just recently gotten a car and a job, and he said, I really thought that as I got older, that I got to have more and more freedom, and it's a really good deal. And what I'm finding out is that as I get older, I'm more and more like my parents, and it kind of sucks. And I said, no, I empathize with you, because the reality is, as a kid, you look at the adults, and all you see is the freedom. They get to go where they want to, they get to buy what they want to, they seem to have so much more money and so much more opportunity and so much more freedom. And then as you grow into that, you gradually realize that in fact, that's not the truth, that being an adult is complicated. That you can choose to do a lot of things, but there are consequences associated with those choices. It isn't that we are unable to do bad things. That's not what stops us from doing bad things. It's the consequences of those bad things that stop us from doing it, or making bad choices. I could quit my job if I wanted to. They're not gonna make me work there. This isn't a slave labor society. So I could quit my job if I wanted to, as long as I was okay with not paying bills and not eating and, you know, things like that, you know? And so when we, as an adult, you realize that while you have more freedom, and that's a good thing, that you also have a much better sense of the obligations that come with having freedom. And that's the whole thing about Christianity. Christianity is a religion for grown-ups. And I don't mean like, that's why we can't have little, you know, teenagers baptized. That's not my point. Christianity is a grown-up religion. Most of the religions that have preceded it are religions for children. They're religions for people that want to have rules and procedures and don't necessarily need to have a specific sense of why, a specific sense of responsibility. Christianity says, here's the why, now you figure out what to do. And that is probably most visible in the Sabbath day, and in that particular command, more than any of the other ones. So.
The rich young ruler got himself in trouble
Yeah.
because he kept wanting to know what to do, what to do, and when Christ finally told him,
All right, here you go.
because he was doing what he thought he should be doing, and he would have been fine if he would have just went on and done what he kept thinking he needed to do. But when Christ told him what he should do, then he didn't like that.
Right.
And he had to go away, you
Right.
know, and, yeah. So he got himself into trouble by wanting that.
That's true.
What to do, what to do.
Too much specificity can be a
Yeah.
dangerous thing, so.
Because
Okay.
sometimes you have situations where you would love to have black and white, I have
Right.
to do it this
Right.
way. And then you could say, I'm doing the Lord's way, so don't get at me, right?
Unfortunately, as you grow up, one of the first things you learn is that black and white is not that it's not that common.
It's
So,
not
you
that
know,
common.
yeah. Jerry, you're gonna pretty much wrap us up, so make it good.
And there is a group that believes absolutely that in your sign out front of the building, the Church of Christ, the church should not be
Oh,
capitalized.
yes.
Now that appears, I guess I'm saying that verse applies to that group.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just, yeah, I mean, well, there's a lot of different verses that can apply to
Yeah.
that group, but, I mean, it's always fascinating to me because when you encounter someone who is that entrenched in their thinking, we think, oh, if they just heard the right argument, I can explain it. I know exactly what's wrong with their thinking, and I can show it to them, and I can explain it, and they're going to realize the error of their ways. And the thing is, it's just like what another thing Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. They've heard all those arguments, and it has made no dent in their thinking, and never will, unless they have some sort of experiential something that changes their thinking for some other reason. That's the reality with us, and that's why I think to some extent Paul's teaching in Romans is relevant. Because what he's saying, I mean, there's a lot of reasons it's relevant, but in this particular context, it's relevant because what he's basically saying is, look, just let them do what they're going to do. You know, if you make it your crusade to tell them why they're wrong, you're just as wrong as they are. You're wasting your time. Go do something useful and let them get hung up on what they do. You know, somebody's determined that they have to, you know, worship on the Sabbath, on the seventh day instead of Sunday. Don't get into an argument with them. You want to have an interesting, friendly discussion, sure, but don't make it your purpose in life to show them why they're wrong. I think that mindset has been, and that's something that has been a part of the Church of Christ mindset for a long time. We used to love to have debates, as though we were going to gather a bunch of Baptists together and convince them like being a Baptist was wrong, you know, after they've been doing it their whole lives and heard everybody else tell them why it was wrong too. You know, really, did we really think that was going to accomplish very much? And I guess sometimes it sort of did because people didn't have anything else to do but go to debate. There was no TV or internet or anything like that, so I guess there was something. But the fact is that we get so fixated on trying to fix other people, and we forget that we're not actually capable of fixing anyone. That God is the only one who fixes people, and the way He does it is through the gospel, not through us telling other people how wrong they are. You know,
trying to pick a splinter out of someone else's eye with
it's
a log.
kind of like that. It is. It's kind of like that. So, all right, that's enough of this. I think. Let me see. There was. Yeah, we may move on. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about with this, but we may move on because some of that point has already been made. So, one way or another, though, we're going to be on to the next commandment, either next Sunday or the Sunday after that. So, thank you, guys.